This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment. All names, characters, and events are fictional. I remember the moment the applause faded. It should have been a proud day. Fort Belvoir decorated with small flags and soft afternoon light. A row of chairs filled with people who barely knew me yet smiled politely as if they understood what 16 years of service had cost. My mother sat in the front row holding her purse with both hands. Beside her was Ron, my stepfather, whose approval I had stopped chasing long ago, even though the sting of his voice still lived somewhere deep in my chest. When the silver oak leaves were pinned on my collar and the words, "Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel Ellison," rang out, the room rose to clap, but Ron did not bother to lift his hands. He only leaned back in his chair, wearing the same smirk I had known since childhood. The reception that followed was supposed to be light and warm, yet his presence chilled everything it touched. While my colleagues exchanged compliments and handshakes, Ron raised his voice just enough for nearby guests to hear and said, "So Lieutenant Colonel now still just clicking keyboards. Real soldiers carry rifles, sweetheart." A few officers shifted uncomfortably. My mother lowered her gaze. I kept my breath steady the way the Air Force had trained me. Calm under pressure, calm under attack, calm when every instinct wanted to bury my rage beneath a mountain of silence. I told myself to let it pass the way I had done for years, but then my secure phone vibrated in my pocket in a very specific pattern. 3 sharp pulses, then 2 long, then 3 sharp again. Pattern Alpha 6. A code that did not activate unless something was seriously wrong. I tapped the screen and the red notice glowed like an alarm in my bloodstream. Possible penetration detected on Eastern Grid. Possible NORAD uplink anomaly. Immediate recall required. For a second, the room flickered as the lights above dimmed, then steadied again. Guests laughed nervously, thinking it was nothing more than a loose wire. Ron chuckled. "Why is this base struggling to pay its electric bill?" He took another sip from his champagne glass, and I felt something inside me settle into a cold, unwavering line. A senior captain standing nearby noticed the color on my phone and whispered, "Did they just activate you?" I did not answer because in that moment a sound rolled over the roof of the hall. A low, tight rotor beat. Not a training aircraft, not a transport bird. This was fast, precise, unmistakably special operations. Conversations froze. People rushed toward the windows. I moved with measured steps as if my body already knew what waited outside. On the front lawn, a black MH-6 helicopter settled onto the grass, throwing leaves and dust into a spiral. 3 operators in dark gear jumped out and scanned the perimeter with focused urgency. Without hesitation, they walked straight through the crowd, straight past the senior officers, straight to me. The lead operator lifted his helmet and shouted, "Lieutenant Colonel Ellison, you are urgently needed at the Pentagon. Eastern Grid signature matches hostile intrusion. NORAD requests your immediate presence." Every face turned toward me. Ron dropped his glass. My mother pressed a hand to her mouth. For the first time, the truth of my work stood exposed beneath open sky. The operator gestured toward the waiting helicopter. "We are wheels up in 20 seconds, ma'am." I stepped forward, feeling the entire room fall behind me like a fading echo, and as the rotor wash whipped across my uniform, I finally understood that this was the moment my life would break from everything I had been taught to fear. I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, in a small brick house on a quiet street lined with oak trees that looked peaceful from the outside, yet never managed to hide the tension that lived within our walls. When I think back to my childhood, the first sensation that returns is not the smell of breakfast or the sound of cartoons on Saturday mornings, but the constant awareness of Ron, my stepfather, and the way his presence pushed itself into every corner of my young life. He arrived when I was 8, a tall man with clipped speech who shook hands too firmly and carried himself like the whole world needed to be corrected by him. At first, he pretended to be kind, buying small gifts and offering smiles that felt stiff as if he had practiced them in a mirror. Those moments did not last long. Once he realized my mother depended on him financially and emotionally, he began shaping the house around his own needs and expectations. I remember nights when my mother and I whispered in the kitchen because we knew if he heard our voices, he would step in and tell us to be quiet, not because he needed silence, but because he enjoyed creating it. He criticized the way I sat, the way I spoke, the way I breathed when I concentrated on homework. He corrected everything until I stopped trying to do anything that might attract attention. I learned to shrink myself into corners and move lightly as if the air would break beneath me. His favorite phrase was, "You will never be good enough," and he used it for chores, for grades, for the way I tied my shoes, for the way I smiled in family photos. If I brought home an A, he asked why it was not an A+. If I cleaned the dishes, he ran a finger across the rim and pointed out the streak I missed. My mother wanted to keep peace, so she often said, "Ron just wants the best for you," but she never looked me in the eyes when she said it, and I understood even at a young age that she was saying it to herself more than to me. Gaslighting became the quiet rhythm of the household. When I cried, he asked why I was making things up. When I withdrew into myself, he told my mother that I was manipulating her. When I tried to explain how his words made me feel, he accused me of being dramatic or disrespectful. Childhood should be a time when a person learns who they are, but in our house, I only learned who I was not, which was good enough for him. I remember a night when I was 12, one of those humid Virginia evenings where the air sticks to your skin. I had spent hours working on a school project designing a small poster about the solar system. I was proud because I had colored every planet carefully and planned out the distances with string measured to scale. As I taped it to the wall to show my mother, Ron walked in without knocking. He stood there for a moment, then laughed lightly the way someone laughs when a child makes a silly mistake, and he said, "That is not to scale, not even close." Then he added softly yet sharply, "You are wasting your time." I watched him walk away, and I felt something unravel inside me, not because my drawing was wrong, but because I realized he would never allow anything I did to matter, even when it was harmless, even when it was good. My mother came in later and said, "I think he is just tired," but the ache in my chest told me the truth, that she was tired, too tired of trying to stand between us, tired of explaining away a man who did not want to be explained. Over the years, his control grew quieter and therefore heavier. He wanted to know what friends I talked to, what books I read, how long I spent in my room. He questioned everything until questioning felt normal. There were evenings when he sat at the dinner table scrutinizing me like a supervisor, reviewing an employee who had disappointed him, and I would grip my fork carefully because any sign of agitation would lead to another lecture about how I needed discipline and humility if I wanted a real future. The irony was that he never believed I could have one. By the time I reached high school, I understood that Ron was not simply strict, but someone who needed authority the way others need oxygen. Yet despite everything, a small part of me refused to collapse beneath him. I found refuge in the school library, in the computer lab, in the quiet feeling of understanding something complex that no one could take away from me. That is where I first discovered an interest in systems and patterns, in the way networks communicate the invisible threads that hold large structures together. It was the one thing Ron could not interrupt because he did not understand it. And perhaps because he could not understand it, he dismissed it as unimportant, which later became the very reason I chose the path that carried me far away from him. Still, the emotional imprint of those years stayed with me longer than any bruise could have. Words leave marks even when no one sees them. They shape the way a person breathes and stands and thinks. Yet they also teach a person how to rise. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder how many others grew up with a voice like his hovering over them, reminding them of every imagined inadequacy. Maybe that is why I ask you this tonight. If you have ever been told you will never be good enough, what moment finally proved them wrong? I did not decide to join the Air Force in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones that added up until I could no longer ignore the truth that staying in that house meant slowly suffocating under the weight of who Ron insisted I was. By the time I turned 18, I had memorized every contour of his voice, the way it rose when he wanted control and fell into a cold quiet when he wanted to punish. I had learned to predict his moods the same way meteorologists predict storms, by studying pressure changes and darkening skies, except in my case, the pressure never lifted. Even when I was old enough to understand that his cruelty came from his own failures, it still settled into my bones like a truth whispered too often. The thought of living 4 more years under his roof while attending a nearby college made my chest tighten in a way that felt physical. So I began searching for any path that would give me distant structure and clarity. I remember sitting in the back of the school library one afternoon staring at a brochure someone had left on a table. It was simple blue and white with the Air Force symbol in the center and the words "Aim High" above a picture of recruits in training. I picked it up without thinking and felt something shift inside me. The brochure talked about purpose, discipline, leadership, and the idea of becoming someone defined not by history but by action. It was the first time I saw a path out, and I held onto it the way a drowning person holds onto a floating board. When I met with the recruiter, he told me about the different roles available, including cyber operations, a field that was growing rapidly. I felt a spark I had not felt in years, a sense that my fascination with systems and patterns could become more than a quiet escape. I filled out the paperwork without telling my mother or Ron. I knew what their reactions would be, and I wanted my decision to exist without their voices pulling it apart. When I finally told them, the kitchen fell silent. My mother blinked at me with a mixture of fear and pride, but Ron leaned back in his chair with a slow smile that told me he believed he had already won whatever argument he thought we were having. "Military needs real men, not girls with laptops," he said with a laugh, and I felt my hands clench against my sides. He asked how long I thought I would last before begging to come home. I knew then that nothing would satisfy him, not even my success, and once I understood that his approval no longer had power over me. I left for Maxwell Air Force Base a week after graduation, stepping onto the bus with a single duffel bag and a heart that was equal parts fear and determination. Training at Maxwell was the first place where the rules made sense to me. Orders were clear. Expectations were written. Discipline was earned, not demanded through intimidation. The instructors did not care who I had been, they cared about who I could become. The sounds of morning drill's boots striking pavement and voices calling cadence formed a rhythm that settled something inside me. For the first time, structure felt like freedom. I learned to push my limits, both physical and mental. I learned to hold steady under stress, to trust the people beside me, to understand that effort did not need to be perfect to be valuable. But it was in the cyber training building where I felt something awaken. Rows of computers hummed with quiet electricity, and the instructors spoke about threats not in terms of brute force, but in terms of logic patterns, misdirection, digital footprints, and invisible battles that determined the safety of millions. The complexity of it drew me in. Unlike Ron, who saw the world through force, cyber defense required a different kind of strength, one built on attention to detail, patience, and the ability to see connections others missed. I excelled quickly, not because I wanted praise, but because for the first time, my mind felt useful. I could trace anomalies through lines of code like following threads through a maze, and the instructors noticed. They challenged me with harder scenarios, and I responded with a focus that surprised even me. Each success felt like stitching myself back together from all the pieces Ron had tried to tear apart. There were nights in the barracks when I lay awake exhausted but proud, knowing that every mile I ran, every exam I completed, every simulation I mastered was another step away from the house where I had learned to stay small. I knew Ron still believed I would fail. He sent a short message halfway through training that simply said, "Hope this is not too much for you." It was not concern. It was a taunt. I stared at the screen and felt no anger, only clarity. His voice no longer carried weight inside me. By the time I finished at Maxwell, I had earned commendations in cyber analysis and a reputation among instructors for being able to spot irregularities faster than most trainees. They told me I had a mind built for early warning detection, for understanding patterns before they formed into threats. For the first time in my life, someone saw my strength without trying to crush it. When I looked at myself in the mirror at graduation, I saw a person I had never met before, someone standing straight shoulders back, no fear in her gaze. I had built myself from the inside out, and even now, as I tell this part of my story, I wonder how many people find their freedom the same way, by stepping towards something instead of running from someone. Maybe you have felt that too, that quiet moment when you finally chose your own life. If you have ever made a decision that no one believed in except you, I would like to know what pushed you forward. My first deployment came in early 2012 when I was 24, and the Air Force sent me to Afghanistan as part of a cyber support element attached to an operations unit stationed near Bagram. The war was changing by then, shifting from visible battles to invisible ones fought through networks, sensors, and signals. I arrived expecting heat dust and tension, but what surprised me most was the constant hum of activity inside the small converted office that housed our equipment. The room smelled of metal wiring and strong coffee, and the screens flickered with endless streams of data that never slept. My role was to assist with analysis on low-level intrusions against our communications systems, but almost immediately I felt myself leaning forward, pulled by the complexity of it. Every data spike felt like a clue, every irregular pattern like a whisper of something larger. A senior sergeant showed me how to read the logs, how to trace movements across nodes, how to filter the noise from the signal, but after a few days, he stopped explaining because I was already moving faster than his instructions. I remember one night when the heat refused to fade even after sunset and the generators trembled with the weight of nonstop rotation. A junior analyst mentioned a strange fluctuation in a routine packet, traced something tiny, something that could have easily been dismissed as background chatter. Most people would have ignored it, but something about the timing and the signature pulled at me. I stayed long after the others left, cross-referencing patterns from the previous week, comparing timestamp intervals and scanning logs I was not even assigned to. What emerged was a faint trail linking separate attempts at probing our systems, each spaced just far enough apart to avoid automatic alerts. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable once fully mapped. When I presented the findings to our supervising officer, he raised an eyebrow and said, "You were not scheduled for this watch. I thought I might get reprimanded, but instead, he forwarded my report straight to command." The next morning, a briefing was called, and the officer explained that my detection had prevented a large-scale disruption attempt targeting our satellite communication uplink for the region. I sat quietly at the back of the room while the others discussed countermeasures, but inside me something stirred a sense that my mind had found its natural terrain. Not long after that incident, a visiting colonel from the cyber division arrived on base to conduct an assessment. He was a sharp-eyed man with a calm voice and a posture that suggested he could see several steps ahead of everyone else. During a walkthrough, he stopped behind my workstation and asked a simple question about the method I had used to identify the anomaly. I explained it quickly, expecting him to move on, but instead, he asked me to elaborate, and the conversation expanded into a detailed breakdown of predictive pattern analysis. At the end, he nodded slowly and said, "You see things early, Lieutenant Ellison. That is not common." I did not respond because I could not tell whether it was a compliment or an evaluation, but the next day, my supervisor informed me that the colonel had requested my reports from the past month. From that point forward, my reputation spread quietly in the way that often happens in the military through the informal channels that matter more than official ones. Senior analysts began stopping by my station asking for my perspective on irregular log behavior or unexplained latency spikes. At first, I thought they were testing me, but eventually I realized they genuinely valued the way I interpreted information. More than once, I caught someone watching me as if trying to understand how my mind moved from one connection to another. The truth was that I did not think faster than others. I simply noticed when something felt off the same way some people can sense when a storm is coming before the sky changes. Amid the long nights and the constant weight of deployment, I found something that grounded me. There was order inside the chaos, not imposed from outside, but discovered through attention and intuition. Even when rockets sounded in the distance, or when the base lights flickered from power strain, I felt steady because the work absorbed everything. Yet despite my growing confidence, I still heard Ron in the back of my mind telling me that computers were for girls who could not handle real challenges. That voice tried to rise whenever I achieved something significant, but each success chipped away at its strength. By the time my deployment ended, I had contributed to several intelligence reports and early detection models that were later referenced in broader defense analysis. When the colonel returned briefly before my rotation ended, he shook my hand and said, "You may want to consider advanced training in early warning systems. You have a talent for spotting anomalies others overlook." It was the closest anyone had come to telling me I belonged somewhere. When I flew back to the United States, I felt both older and clearer, as if all the dust of Afghanistan had settled inside me and revealed the outline of who I was becoming. I carried home not just medals or certificates, but a quiet conviction that my path was not simply about escaping Ron, but about stepping into something larger than anything he could understand. Even now, as I think about those early recognitions, I wonder if every life has a moment when a person sees who they might be for the first time. Have you ever had that feeling, that sudden shift when you realize you are capable of more than anyone ever told you? Returning home after Afghanistan felt strangely anticlimactic because instead of applause or pride, I stepped back into the same small Alexandria house where Ron still carried himself like the ruler of a private kingdom, and my mother still hovered around him as if trying to keep the peace by predicting his shifts of mood. I had changed, but the house had not, and the moment I walked through the door, I felt the air tighten around me like an old uniform that no longer fit. My mother hugged me lightly, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice while Ron stayed seated at the kitchen table, reading a newspaper he probably did not care about. He glanced up only long enough to say, "You are back then," returned to his paper with a sigh that implied inconvenience. I told myself not to expect more, but a small part of me still felt that familiar sting. Over the next few days, I tried to reconnect with my mother, but every conversation seemed to bend around Ron like furniture arranged for his comfort. He asked pointed questions about my deployment, but only to dismiss the answers. When I mentioned cyber support, he smirked and said, "That hardly sounds dangerous unless you broke a nail on the keyboard." I learned quickly that the only way to avoid conflict was to speak little and disappear into my old bedroom when possible. Yet even from there, I heard him muttering to my mother about how I was wasting my life in a job that did not build character. She would defend me softly, but he always overpowered her with volume or sarcasm. The contrast between who I had become in the Air Force and who I became in that house felt jarring, like I stepped backward into a version of myself I no longer recognized. The turning point came when I received word that my leadership was recommending me for promotion to lieutenant colonel, a milestone that even seasoned officers do not always reach. When I saw the email, I stared at the screen, stunned, not because I doubted my work, but because it was the first time someone formalized my value without discounting it. I felt pride, steady and warm, growing through me like sunlight through a window. I wanted to share the news with my mother, even though I expected her reaction to be dimmed by Ron. When I told her, she gasped and covered her mouth with both hands, tears pooling in her eyes as she whispered, "I knew you were meant for more." Ron, however, leaned against the counter and said, "That seems fast. Are they promoting anyone with basic computer skills these days?" I felt the words hit me, but they no longer cut the same way because Afghanistan and Maxwell and everything I had built since then formed a kind of armor he could not pierce. I simply said, "It is based on performance, not opinion," and walked away before he could respond. The week leading up to the ceremony at Fort Belvoir was tense. My mother tried to act excited, helping me prepare my service dress uniform and smoothing stray threads while Ron complained about the inconvenience of attending. He asked repeatedly whether the ceremony would last long, whether there would be any real officers present, and whether I was sure I understood the responsibilities of the rank. I answered each question calmly, though inside I felt that churning awareness that he would try to spoil the moment if given the chance. The night before the ceremony, I stayed up late in my childhood bedroom polishing my shoes and reading over the mission reports I had contributed to earlier that year. Each page reminded me that I had earned this, not escaped into it, earned it. Yet even with that certainty, I felt the old anxiety creeping in, the fear that Ron would find a way to turn the day into something humiliating. When morning arrived, the house was quiet, except for the sound of Ron moving around in the kitchen. I came downstairs in uniform, and my mother looked at me with raw pride, but Ron narrowed his eyes as if assessing whether I deserved the fabric on my shoulders. He stepped closer and said in a low voice, "Do not embarrass yourself." I held his gaze and realized I felt something I had never felt toward him before. Not fear, not anger, but detachment, as if his voice no longer connected to any part of me that mattered. I walked past him without answering and felt the first breath of freedom settle into my chest. On the drive to Fort Belvoir, my mother fussed with her hair and kept turning around to smile at me while Ron stared out the window with that impatient posture he wore whenever the world did not center around him. I kept my focus on the sky on the base gates as they approached on the crisp morning air that felt sharp enough to cut through every doubt he had tried to build inside me. When we arrived, officers greeted us warmly, recognizing my name from reports and training assignments. Ron stiffened as if the respect they showed me contradicted everything he believed about my worth. My mother clutched her purse with pride, and I felt a small bloom of hope for her knowing she deserved a version of life that did not revolve around appeasing a man who diminished everyone around him. Before the ceremony began, I found a quiet moment in the hallway and reflected on the journey from my childhood to Afghanistan to the present. Every insult, every dismissal, every time Ron told me I lacked real strength had shaped the fire inside me, but it no longer burned with pain. Now it burned with purpose. Sometimes I wonder how many people carry voices from their past that try to pull them down every time they rise. Maybe you know that feeling too. That moment before something important, when you still hear the echo of someone who once tried to make you small. If you have ever faced that before a milestone in your life, I would like to hear how you moved forward despite it. The ceremony room at Fort Belvoir was brighter than I expected, with tall windows that let in clean morning light and rows of perfectly spaced chairs filled with uniforms and families who carried themselves with pride. The air felt charged with a quiet reverence, the kind that settles over a gathering when everyone understands the significance of the moment. I walked in between two senior officers, and for a brief second it felt surreal that I was not simply attending, but standing at the center of it. My mother sat in the front row, twisting a tissue nervously in her hands, and beside her, Ron slouched in his chair, looking around as if searching for something worth his attention. I tried to ignore him as I took my place near the podium, but the weight of his presence pressed against me like an unwelcome shadow. The colonel overseeing the ceremony spoke about leadership integrity and the demands of responsibility, and each word reminded me of the long nights in Afghanistan, the countless hours spent building detection models, the quiet decisions I had made that never reached public view. When he called my name, I stepped forward, feeling every pair of eyes follow me as I approached. My heart climbed into a slow, steady rhythm, the kind that comes not from fear, but from recognition of how far I had come. The pinning itself was simple. 2 officers placed the silver oak leaves onto my collar with crisp precision, and the room responded with applause that rose in warm waves. I saw my mother lift her trembling hands to clap, and for a moment my chest tightened with emotion. I wished that moment could have lasted untouched, but Ron leaned back, crossed his arms, and shook his head slightly, as if the entire ceremony were a staged performance that failed to impress him. When the applause faded, we moved to the reception area, where tables of refreshments were arranged neatly, and people mingled in small clusters offering congratulations. I greeted colleagues and commanders, but every time I glanced toward my mother, I saw her attention split between pride for me and anxiety about Ron, who hovered beside her with the restless energy of someone looking for a place to inject his opinions. I should have known he would not let the day end quietly. It happened when a captain approached me with a respectful smile and said, "I read your report on anomaly mapping. Brilliant work, Lieutenant Colonel." Before I could respond, Ron stepped closer, raising his voice just enough for nearby guests to hear. "Do you all really need reports for this kind of job?" he asked with a laugh. "She mostly works with the computers. You know, clicking things on screen's not exactly battlefield level." The captain blinked confused, trying to understand whether Ron was joking, but the laugh that followed was loud enough to turn several heads. My mother whispered Ron please, but he brushed her aside lightly as if shooing away a mosquito. The humiliation spread through me slow and cold, not because I believed anything he said, but because he chose this moment, a moment that should have belonged to years of effort and sacrifice to remind me of who he insisted I was. Another officer stepped in, offering me a polite out by asking a question about my next assignment, but Ron interrupted again, saying, "I just hope they did not promote her out of pity. You know how these things work sometimes." People lowered their glasses and looked away, uncomfortable with the abrupt shift in tone, but none of them knew him, and no one knew how many variations of that insult I had heard since childhood. I steadied my breath. My training had taught me how to stay calm under pressure, and right then that skill mattered more than any commendation. I looked at him without anger. Just a strange mix of sadness and understanding because in that moment I realized he would never change. The problem was not that he underestimated me. The problem was that he needed to. It was the only way he could feel taller. I excused myself from the group and stepped aside to regain my composure, but his voice followed once more, slicing through the room like a dull blade. Do not walk away when I am talking. You always do this. Think you are too good for everyone. A hush fell around us, and even my mother froze as if afraid that moving would make things worse. I turned slowly and met his eyes, and what I felt at that moment was not humiliation, but clarity as clean and sharp as the light through the windows. I said calmly, I am not walking away from you, Ron. I am walking toward my future. He rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath, but for the first time in my life, it did not land anywhere inside me. One of the senior officers approached, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder, and asked, Is everything all right, Lieutenant Colonel? I nodded, though part of me wished I could apologize for the disruption, even though I knew it was not mine to carry. The ceremony continued, the chatter resumed, but the energy had shifted. People sensed the fracture, even if they did not understand its depth. When I looked at my mother, she gave me a small, helpless smile that broke my heart because she was torn between the daughter she wanted to support and the man she felt obligated to protect. As I walked toward the exit to get a breath of fresh air, I caught a glimpse of the promotion pamphlet on a table, and something inside me whispered a reminder that sometimes the ones who belittle us are simply terrified of the strength they see growing. And maybe you have known someone like that too. Someone who tried to make your achievements smaller so they could feel larger. If you have ever had to stand tall in a moment when someone tried to pull you down, I wonder how you found the strength to stay steady. I had just stepped outside the reception hall to steady my thoughts when my secure phone vibrated inside my uniform pocket with a force and rhythm that froze me in place. It was not the familiar buzz of a normal message or the sharp jolt of a priority call. This pattern was unmistakable and rare. 3 abrupt pulses, 2 long ones, then 3 more abrupt, a coded rhythm that every officer with my clearance level hoped they would never hear. I reached for the device with hands that suddenly felt heavier than my own body, and when the black screen lit up, the letters burned across it in a stark crimson glow. Red Protocol Eastern Grid Anomaly detected immediate evaluation required. For a second, the noise of the reception behind me faded until all I could hear was my own heartbeat, steady, slow, prepared. I opened the message fully and watched a stream of diagnostic data scroll down live readings from the Eastern Seaboard power grid, accompanied by irregular spikes that did not match any scheduled maintenance logs or known environmental disturbances. They formed a pattern jagged but deliberate, and I felt a chill, though the afternoon air was warm. At first glance, the anomaly looked like a simple fluctuation, but something about the timing and the spacing tugged at me in that familiar way. Patterns speak without words. The grid did not simply fail. It spoke through numbers and signatures, and I had spent my entire career learning how to listen. I zoomed in on the repeating intervals and cross-referenced them with baseline models stored in my phone. The deviation was small, almost elegant, which was what made it so concerning. Simple errors are messy. This was precise. Inside the reception hall, music resumed, and people began clapping for another officer who had just finished a speech, but their voices sounded distant, as if carried through water. I stepped farther from the doorway and ran a deeper scan on the anomaly. As predicted, more information loaded, showing a series of micro-disruptions not long enough to cause widespread outages, but absolutely long enough to indicate a live test probing weaknesses. Someone was mapping our responses by pushing just hard enough to trigger internal adjustments without drawing public attention. That type of probing required skill access and intention. As the data populated, I felt a familiar tightening low in my stomach, the same one I felt in Afghanistan the night I identified the packet trail that saved our uplink. Except this time, the scope was not a base. It was half the eastern seaboard. While I was processing the second wave of diagnostics, Captain Reeves stepped outside, wiping sweat from his forehead, and spotted the illumination on my phone. His eyes widened immediately. "Is that what I think it is?" he asked, voice dropping into instinctive caution. I nodded without looking up and angled the screen so he could read the header. His posture changed instantly, shoulders straightening, breath catching. "Red protocol," he whispered. "You sure this is not a false trigger?" Before he even finished the question, the next data packet rolled in, confirming what I already suspected. The anomaly had jumped nodes in a pattern too coordinated for random error, and the timestamps matched an intrusion style flagged months earlier in classified briefings. "This is real," I said. He exhaled sharply, scanning the numbers. "Do we know the point of origin?" "Not yet," I replied. "The signal looks like it was scrubbed through several relay points. Could be masking. Could be injected. But the signature does not look domestic." Reeves rubbed his forehead. "We need to notify command right now." "I already sent acknowledgement," I said. "They will track my location." He stared at me for a long moment, then glanced toward the reception hall where people still mingled, unaware that their celebration existed in the same moment as a possible large-scale national threat. He lowered his voice even further. "Do you think this is linked to the NORAD uplink brief from last quarter? The one about irregular pre-attack signatures?" "Yes," I said, because the resemblance was undeniable. It mirrored the earliest stage of those simulations. A test, a quiet push, a whisper that could become a roar. And someone needed to answer it before it grew into something unstoppable. My secure phone flashed again this time, demanding biometric confirmation. I pressed my thumb against the pad, and another set of encrypted messages appeared. The first line read, Colonel Ellison, report elevation, confirmed standby for extraction. My stomach dropped, though my expression stayed calm. Reeves read the text over my shoulder and muttered, "This is going to move fast. Officers rarely used extraction protocols unless timing mattered down to seconds." My mind raced through potential scenarios, but I forced myself to focus on the data in front of me. The anomaly was accelerating, shifting its pattern as if reacting to internal attempts to stabilize the grid. That meant the intrusion was active, not dormant. It was learning. From the doorway, a few officers noticed Reeves and me standing apart with grim expressions, and one of them, a major from engineering, began walking toward us. "Everything all right?" he asked, already sounding unconvinced. I tilted the screen so he could see the classification level, and the moment he recognized the header, he paled. "Red protocol." He looked back toward the hall where Ron was likely still complaining about seating arrangements or the temperature in the room, and for a moment, the contrast felt absurd. A man mocking my entire career just steps away from a situation he could not even begin to comprehend. The major swallowed hard before speaking. "Do we have confirmation from Joint Command?" I nodded and pointed to the encrypted timestamp. "Command just elevated to priority status. Grid anomaly unstable. Potential expansion. We may be dealing with coordinated probing." Reeves muttered, "This fast. This clean. Someone practiced for this." My phone vibrated again, but this time the tone was different, a short, urgent pattern indicating imminent arrival. I knew exactly what it meant. Extraction inbound. I took one last look at the shifting numbers on my screen, knowing that whatever was happening might escalate far beyond what anyone in that reception could imagine. I turned to the officers beside me, who were now tense and silent. "Whatever you see next remains classified," I said. They nodded, and in that suspended moment before the arrival, I felt the weight of every choice that had led me to this point, not fear, but readiness. Sometimes the world gives no warning before it demands everything from you. Have you ever felt a shift like that one moment when your entire life changes direction without asking permission? The vibration in my secure phone had barely faded when the distant thrum of rotor blades began to ripple through the air with a sound so sharp and fast that every instinct in my body snapped to attention. It was not the deep, rhythmic pulse of a standard transport helicopter. This sound was tighter, more aggressive, the unmistakable audio signature of an MH-6 aircraft built for speed maneuverability and missions that rarely appeared on public records. Captain Reeves and the Major exchanged glances, both of them understanding immediately that the situation had escalated beyond analytical review into something requiring immediate physical extraction. The sound grew louder, slicing through the calm afternoon until the windows of the reception hall trembled. A few guests stepped outside, confused, shading their eyes against the sun, while others remained in the doorway murmuring questions. The rotor wash hit first, a blast of wind that sent programs and napkins flying across the grass as the small black helicopter descended into the open courtyard directly in front of the building. People gasped and stumbled backward, clutching their uniforms or dresses as the downforce whipped through the area. Even through the chaos, the aircraft moved with absolute precision, settling into a crouched landing posture with the ease of something designed for rapid approach and quicker departure. The MH-6 bore no visible markings, no unit identifiers, only matte black plating and the faint shimmer of specialized equipment along its frame. Before the skids fully touched the ground, 2 operators jumped out, moving like shadows cloaked in dark gear helmets with visors, lowered weapons positioned at low ready but angled with careful discipline. A third operator followed, signaling clearance to the others, then scanning the perimeter with an efficiency that silenced every stray conversation. Guests who had been laughing moments earlier now stood frozen, their expressions shifting from confusion to awe to fear as they realized this was not part of any ceremony or demonstration. The operators did not pause. They did not look around for guidance. They moved with absolute purpose directly toward me. My breath caught in my throat, though my face remained calm, because training teaches you how to hold still when everything else begins to shake. Reeves stepped aside instinctively, recognizing the chain of command even before any words were spoken. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people shifted out of the operator's path, creating a narrow corridor through which they advanced. I felt dozens of eyes on me, but none more burning than Ron's. He stood half inside the doorway, mouth slightly open, his hand still wrapped around the stem of a champagne glass that now trembled just enough to catch the light. For a long second, he seemed unable to speak, unable to process the scene unfolding 10 feet from him as the men he believed he understood the military he claimed to know walked right past every officer in the room with their focus locked entirely on me. The lead operator stopped only inches away, snapping his heels together with a sharp, precise click that cut through the roar of the rotors. He lifted his visor, revealing steady, determined eyes, and called out in a voice that rumbled across the courtyard. "Lieutenant Colonel Mara Ellison, ma'am, you are required for immediate transport to the Pentagon. Eastern Grid Anomaly confirmed as active. NORAD requests your presence in joint operations." The crowd erupted into startled whispers. A few officers stiffened instinctively. Someone dropped a plate that shattered against the concrete. Yet all I heard was the clarity in the operator's tone, a tone that left no room for hesitation. Behind him, the second operator extended a secure tablet with my name encrypted at the top, followed by a flashing alert that verified my authentication request. Several high-ranking officers nearby tensed, visibly realizing the severity of the situation. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her chest, eyes wide with fear. Pride, confusion, perhaps all 3. But Ron stood entirely still, the color draining from his face until his expression looked almost ghostly. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried again, but only a faint rasp escaped, as if the world had suddenly become too large for his voice to reach. The officers nearest to me stepped back to give the operators more space, silently acknowledging that whatever authority they possessed had just been superseded by a mission level they were not cleared to access. I placed my thumb on the tablet completing the biometric check, and when the screen turned green, the lead operator nodded. "We are wheels up in 20 seconds, ma'am. Please follow." As I stepped forward, the air around us seemed to still as if the entire gathering held its breath. The music from inside the hall had stopped long ago, leaving only the rapid churn of the MH-6 filling the space. Papers swirled through the air. Ribbons from the ceremony fluttered across the ground, and every person there watched with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. I felt nothing but focus, every movement deliberate, every breath controlled. But as I passed the doorway, I glanced toward Ron. His eyes met mine wide, unfocused, his earlier arrogance shattered across his face like glass dropped on stone. He mouthed something that looked like Mara, wait, but no sound reached me through the wind. For once, he had no script, no insult, no ground to stand on because the truth stood before him undeniable and public. The daughter he belittled for years, the woman he mocked for working with computers, was now being escorted by special operations for a national-level crisis. I stepped past him without stopping, and the wind from the rotor wash pulled at my uniform as if urging me toward the aircraft. The operators flanked me, forming a protective corridor until we reached the helicopter. The pilot extended a hand, but I climbed aboard with practiced ease, settling into the narrow interior as the door slammed shut. Through the glass, I saw the crowd shrinking their faces, a mix of shock and awe. My mother whispered something I could not hear. Ron remained motionless, still mouthing empty words that held no weight now that the truth was exposed. The pilot lifted off and the courtyard dropped away, disappearing into a blur of colors and stunned expressions. As the helicopter banked toward Washington, I felt the shift deep inside me, the undeniable realization that every step I had taken had led exactly to this moment. Sometimes life reveals the truth so loudly that even those who refused to see it can no longer hide. And I wonder if you have ever experienced a moment when someone finally saw who you truly are. The door of the MH6 slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud, and the interior filled with the vibrating roar of the rotor blades as the helicopter lifted sharply from the ground, pulling Fort Belvoir away from us until it became a shrinking patchwork of uniforms, faces, and confusion. Wind battered the fuselage in rhythmic pulses, but inside the aircraft, everything felt steady, controlled, purposeful. The operators secured their harnesses with quick, practiced efficiency, while the pilot spoke through the headset in a clipped tone that cut cleanly through the noise. Ascending now, ma'am, direct route to the Pentagon air corridor approved. ETA 7 minutes. 7 minutes! That was all the time I had to assess the evolving situation before stepping into a room where every second would matter. I adjusted my headset and opened the secure tablet as its encrypted display flickered to life, showing live telemetry from the Eastern Seaboard power grid. At first glance, the fluctuations appeared scattered, almost innocent, but I knew better than to trust surface-level noise. Patterns hide in chaos, and the signature I saw pulsing across the grid nodes carried the same unsettling precision that had caught my attention earlier. One of the operators leaned closer to be heard over the hum. "We received elevation from Joint Command 5 minutes ago. Priority 1 directive. They requested you by name." I nodded, not out of confidence, but acknowledgement of responsibility. The pilot banked hard to the right, giving me a brief view of the Virginia tree line rushing beneath us like dark waves. Dusk had settled over the landscape, deepening the shadows of the forest, while strips of highway glowed faintly under broken patterns of streetlights. Some lights flickered. Some had already dimmed. That alone sent a ripple of concern through me because power grids do not falter in fragments without a reason. The fluctuations on the tablet sharpened as new data streamed in. Multiple nodes between Richmond and Baltimore showed irregular relay patterns like pressure points in the grid being pressed by an unseen hand. It was subtle, too subtle for public detection, but unmistakable to someone trained in early warning systems. "This is not random," I said more to myself than to the team. Captain Reeves, seated across from me, heard it through the headset and leaned forward. "You think it is coordinated?" "Yes." "And reactive. Watch this." I tapped a section of the map showing an attempted stabilizing cycle from one of the grid control centers. A moment later, the anomaly shifted as if anticipating the correction maneuver. "That is not environmental interference. The timing is too tight." Reeves let out a long breath and muttered, "That looks like someone is testing how fast we respond." "Exactly," I answered, "which means they are not just probing. They are learning." An operator beside me asked, "What is your first read, ma'am?" I studied the rhythm of the pattern, the way the spikes echoed through the nodes like signals bouncing down a corridor. "If it escalates, we risk synchronized failures across the corridor." "Not a blackout, a disruption of monitoring capability." "Which is worse," he said. "Much worse," I replied, "because when a grid stops reporting accurately, you lose early detection for large-scale instability." The pilot interrupted over the comms, airspeed increasing. "Pentagon airspace secured." Recommend prepping primary brief. I could already feel the subtle pressure shift as the aircraft pushed higher, slicing through a cooler layer of air. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving a muted blue-gray light that reflected off the tablet screen. The operators watched me with a quiet tension. Not fear, but readiness, the kind found only in people accustomed to stepping into unknowns without hesitation. I zoomed further into the anomaly cluster, identifying a repeating interval. The gaps were small, almost imperceptible, but consistent. They created a pattern that reminded me of simulated intrusion sequences used in classified training sessions earlier that year. If I was right and the signature belonged to the same family, then the anomaly was not simply an attack. It was a rehearsal. Reeves recognized the look on my face and asked, "What do you see?" "A teaching pattern," I said. "Someone is timing our internal recovery cycles. They want to know how long it takes us to adjust before they intensify the strain." Reeves swore under his breath. "So we are already behind." "Not yet," I said. "But we will be if we do not cut this off before the next escalation window." "How long until that?" I glanced at the shifting timestamp and answered 30 to 60 minutes if the pattern holds. Reeves rubbed his palms against his uniform, and the operators exchanged silent looks, each one understanding how narrow that window truly was. The pilot cut in again. "Ma'am, Joint Command forwarded an initial brief. Patching through now?" The screen updated with a short summary confirming regional fluctuations attempts by grid technicians to stabilize nodes and the possibility of corrupted telemetry streams. My mind worked through the implications, calculating which systems would strain first, which would fail quietly, which would fail loudly, and how each failure could cascade across the eastern corridor. I steadied my breath and spoke clearly. "We need to isolate false reporting streams before they propagate. If telemetry goes blind, we lose situational awareness, and that will force automated rerouting, which is exactly what they want." Reeves asked, "What do you propose?" I responded. "We bypass. Direct feed through Contingency Protocol 7. It will reroute monitoring to the backup array before instability spreads." "That is above our clearance level," he said. "That is why they are recalling me," I answered. The operators listened intently, and one of them said quietly, "Tell us what you need the moment we land." The aircraft suddenly leveled, descending into a direct approach corridor. The Pentagon complex appeared ahead, rising like a vast concrete star against the dimming sky, its perimeter lights glowing steady despite the fluctuations farther south. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from alignment with purpose, the unmistakable certainty that everything I had trained for was converging on this moment. The pilot spoke once more. "Prepare for rapid disembark. We land in 20 seconds. I closed the tablet, took one steady breath, and centered myself. Whatever waited inside that building would require clarity, speed, and absolute focus. Sometimes life does not grant time to think, only time to act. And I wonder if you have ever felt a moment when the world suddenly asked more of you than you expected, yet you stepped forward anyway. The helicopter touched down on the Pentagon landing zone with a jarring thud that vibrated through my boots. And before the rotors had fully slowed, the operator signaled me forward, ushering me across the concrete toward a pair of armed security personnel who verified my identity with a speed that betrayed how urgently I was expected inside. The doors sealed behind us with a heavy mechanical lock that always felt more like a shift in atmosphere than a sound, and the operator guiding me spoke into his headset confirming my arrival. We moved quickly through the corridors where fluorescent lights hummed faintly and the air smelled of cold metal and quiet tension. I had walked these halls many times, but tonight the walls felt narrower, as if the building itself understood how delicate the next hour could be. When we reached the Joint Operations Center, the doors opened to reveal a vast room illuminated by towering screens that displayed live feeds of the power grid airspace telemetry and real-time anomaly tracking. Rows of analysts typed rapidly at their stations while senior officers stood clustered near the central table, their faces lined with concern. The hum of conversation dulled the instant they saw me. A brigadier general stepped forward, his expression hard but relieved. "Lieutenant Colonel Ellison, thank you for coming on such short notice. We need your read immediately." I nodded and moved straight to the primary display where the anomaly signatures pulsed like quiet heartbeats in a system under strain. The officers parted to give me space, and several colonels exchanged looks that said they were already bracing for whatever assessment I would give. I took the secure tablet handed to me and linked it to the main console. The grid map expanded across the screen in glowing lines that flickered whenever the intrusion brushed against key nodes. At first glance, the visual could have passed for a stressed system reacting to environmental triggers or equipment fatigue, but the patterns told a different story. Chaos leaves jagged marks. Nature leaves randomness. But this pattern held intention in the spacing of disruptions, in the repetition of signal distortion, and in the subtle echo between activation cycles. I traced the first anomaly cluster and said, "This is not accidental. Someone is pushing synchronized probes through the relay points." An engineering colonel frowned. "Could be routine interference. Weather can hit those channels in unpredictable ways." "No," I replied, "because predictable ways are exactly what weather produces. Look at this." I highlighted a sequence of disruptions, each separated by precisely increasing intervals. If this were natural, the timing would drift without direction. This is diagnostic probing. Someone is testing how quickly the grid compensates. The room fell quiet except for the rapid clacking of keyboards. A major from cyber leaned closer. "Are you certain?" I adjusted the filter on the display and zoomed into the waveform pattern. The anomaly does not behave like emergent error. It behaves like taught behavior. See this slope? And this dip. That is an adaptive response, not environmental shift. A lieutenant general approached, arms crossed, jaw tight. "We need to know if this is an isolated test or a coordinated infiltration." I studied the secondary cluster that had just updated on the left side of the map. "The infiltration signature is too clean to be isolated. Whoever is doing this is using predictive modeling. They are not testing individual nodes. They are testing our response cycle across the entire corridor. That means they are looking for a timing weakness." The general exhaled slowly. "And if they find one, they could trigger telemetry blindness," I answered. "Not an outage, but a blackout in our monitoring capability. That would blind early warning systems tied to grid stability and could create cascading failures before technicians could intervene." Alarm flickered across several faces. The general asked, "How soon until we lose visibility if the pattern escalates?" I calculated quickly, watching the pulse rate tighten. 30 to 40 minutes if the intrusion continues adapting at this rate. Less if they accelerate. The operations officer muttered something under his breath, too low to hear fully, but the tension in his posture told me everything. I shifted focus to a new data line appearing at the bottom of the screen. Subtle fluctuations in uplink integrity, the same kind of signature that had been flagged in encrypted briefings months earlier, referencing early-stage NORAD interference attempts. My pulse tightened, but my voice stayed steady. This pattern aligns with the uplink anomaly simulations we reviewed last quarter. The room stilled again, and every senior officer turned toward the screen as if expecting the numbers to explain themselves. The general leaned closer. "Are you suggesting this is a pre-coordinated infiltration?" "Yes. It follows the same predictive curve, different vector, same architecture. And if the signatures sync up, we will have simultaneous stress on the grid and uplink monitoring. That is not coincidence. That is orchestration." A colonel rubbed his temple. "Could any domestic actor produce this?" "Not at this sophistication," I answered. "This level of adaptive probing requires long-term access to mimic baseline fluctuations. Someone has studied our grid behavior for months." As more officers crowded around the display, the room took on the heavy charged silence of people bracing for news they had hoped not to hear. The general spoke quietly but firmly. "We need your recommendation, Lieutenant Colonel." I inhaled deeply, letting the full weight of the crisis settle before speaking. "First, we isolate the corrupted telemetry streams. If they blind our visibility, we lose the ability to counter their next move. Second, we activate Contingency Protocol 7 to reroute monitoring through the backup array. Third, we implement a phased dampening cycle to disrupt their probe timing. That will break their predictive model and force them to restart from scratch. That buys us time." Analysts around the room began typing commands while officers relayed instructions to secondary teams. The general asked, "And long-term?" "We prepare for escalation. This is reconnaissance, not the strike. They are learning. We need to stay 3 steps ahead." My voice remained calm, but inside I felt the old familiar shift that happened in Afghanistan when I could sense the shape of a threat forming before anyone else could see it. The general nodded once. Very well. From this moment forward, you have operational lead on anomaly interpretation. All evaluations will be routed through you before final action. A ripple of acknowledgement passed through the room. I felt no pride, only responsibility, the kind that sits heavy in the chest like a silent oath. As I continued analyzing the shifting signatures, I wondered how many people outside this building were living their ordinary evening unaware that the quiet hum of electricity around them depended on the next decisions we made. And I wonder if you have ever experienced a moment when everything seemed normal until the truth revealed itself all at once. The room seemed to tighten around me as the anomaly pulses accelerated across the grid display, each spike landing with a precision that reminded me of synchronized footsteps approaching a locked door. Analysts called out updates in clipped tones, but most of the officers stood silent, their eyes fixed on the shifting lines, as if willing them to stabilize through sheer force of will. I zoomed deeper into the waveform pattern, searching not for the intrusion itself, but for whatever it might be leaving behind. Every system when stressed reveals traces, paths, echoes, even if the source tries to hide them. One of the analysts pointed to a sudden jump near the Baltimore node. That is new, ma'am. I nodded but kept scanning. The signature did not match error behavior. It was too clean, too deliberate. I filtered out predictable noise, then overlaid a secondary diagnostic filter, a tool built for isolating low-level data residue. That was when I saw it, a faint thread of packets slipping between nodes like a whisper. A ghost packet trail. My pulse kicked once sharply. Ghost packets should not exist in this context unless someone wanted them to be invisible. But nothing is invisible if you know what frequency to look for. I magnified the packet stream, transforming the faint thread into a clearer pattern. The colonel beside me frowned. Is that an artifact? No, I answered. Artifacts do not self-correct. Watch this. I tapped a point in the trail, and the signature adjusted with an almost responsive shift. The general leaned forward. What does that mean? It means whoever is behind this is using adaptive packets that mirror grid heartbeat cycles so they can slip through without detection, but the trail leaks just enough residue for me to track. Reeves asked, "Can you trace it back?" Not directly, I said, but I can predict its next target because the interval spacing reveals the model it is using. I overlaid a predictive curve on the map. The ghost trail lined up with the curve almost perfectly. They are mapping our stabilization rhythm and timing their packets to weaken the nodes before shifting phases. The general asked, "What happens next if we do nothing?" I looked him straight in the eye. They trigger synchronized telemetry distortion. That blinds us and destabilizes the grid. He exhaled sharply. Then what is your move, Lieutenant Colonel? I inhaled slowly, grounding myself the way I learned during late nights in Afghanistan when everything depended on the calm you could carve out of chaos. I said, "We break their model. If they are timing their packets off our heartbeat cycles, then we manipulate the heartbeat. Shift it, throw off the pattern." The general gestured toward the display. How long will that take? I studied the ghost trail. They have a 40-second window before their next adjustment cycle. That is our opportunity. 40 seconds in a crisis room feels like both an eternity and a blink. I called to the analysts, "Prepare to activate phased dampening on my command filter, it through Contingency Protocol 7, and isolate the backup array." Then, I began building the response model, constructing a counter pattern designed to distort their timing. If their packets behaved like echoes, I needed to create a false wall to bounce them back and sever the sequence. The analysts typed furiously, rerouting data streams, aligning dampeners, syncing cycle modifiers. The clock on the screen ticked 30 seconds. I refined the model, adding a microsecond delay to mimic instability. 20 seconds. I adjusted the amplitude because a mismatch, even by a fraction, could cause internal feedback. 10 seconds. The ghost trail pulsed brighter, preparing for its next strike. The room went silent. I whispered, "Execute." The dampening cycle launched through the grid like a pulse of controlled turbulence. The ghost packets reacted instantly, wobbling against the unexpected shift. I watched the waveform jitter, then fracture. The predictive curve collapsed. Their model broke. The general gripped the table. "Status," the analysts called out in a rapid staccato. The anomaly rhythm is destabilizing. Packet trail degrading. Multiple nodes showing recovery. Telemetry visibility restored. Intrusion sequence failing. The ghost trail flickered once twice, then vanished from the screen as if swallowed. The lines on the map steadied, settling into normal fluctuations. The corridor stopped pulsing. The room exhaled collectively. The general stared at the display, shaking his head in relief. You cut them off in under a millisecond. I nodded. You have to in cases like this. If you wait even one cycle, the next strike hits twice as hard. Reeves let out a low breath. So that is it. We are clear. For now, I said, because whoever orchestrated this will not give up after one failed attempt. They will reassess and adapt. They always do. But we prevented the cascade. No outages, no blindness, no loss of early warning. The general placed both hands on the table, grounding himself. Do you realize what would have happened if you had not spotted that trail? Yes, sir. That is why spotting it mattered. He nodded slowly, then said with quiet sincerity, You just saved the eastern seaboard. The words hung in the air, heavier than the hum of equipment, louder than the analysts returning to their monitors. I felt no triumph, only clarity, a weight settling into place the way armor settles on shoulders. This is the work. This is the duty. A soft beep interrupted my thoughts. A new message from NORAD confirmed that uplink integrity had fully stabilized. The ghost signatures were gone. I closed the model and set the tablet aside, letting my breath settle. The crisis had not shattered the room, but it had revealed a truth about how thin the line is between ordinary life and the forces that threaten it. And I wonder if you have ever lived a moment where the danger passed so quietly that no one outside the room would ever know what almost happened. The Joint Operations Center had begun to settle back into its controlled rhythm, but before I could fully step away from the console, an aide approached with quick, purposeful strides and said, The Secretary of Defense wants you in his briefing room immediately, Lieutenant Colonel. The weight of those words hit harder than the rotor wash from the helicopter earlier. I followed him through a series of corridors where the lighting felt dimmer, more deliberate, as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of the conversation waiting behind the next secured door. When we arrived, 2 guards verified my credentials, then the door slid open, revealing a room far quieter than the chaos behind us. The secretary stood at the head of a long table, reviewing a series of classified summaries, while several senior officers positioned along the wall straightened the moment they saw me enter. He turned toward me with an expression that mixed relief and calculation, the look of a man who had been preparing for the worst, but found something unexpectedly better. Lieutenant Colonel Ellison, he said, extending a hand. I accepted it and felt his grip firm, steady, conveying acknowledgement without theatrics. Please sit, we have much to discuss. I took a seat across from him as he slid one of the summaries toward me. This is the preliminary assessment of the anomaly event. Your name appears 18 times in the first 2 pages. I could not tell whether that was meant to flatter or ground me, so I remained silent, waiting for his next move. He clasped his hands together and leaned forward. I have been briefed on your detection of the ghost packet trail, on how you broke the infiltration model and how you stabilized the corridor before any visibility loss occurred. His voice carried a low, controlled intensity. Do you understand what would have happened if you had missed any part of that sequence? Yes, sir. A multi-state monitoring blackout, I replied, and the opening they wanted for whatever came next. He nodded. The eastern seaboard owes you more than they will ever know. His words should have felt triumphant, but instead they stirred an unexpected image in my mind. Ron, leaning back in his chair, earlier champagne glass in hand, smirking in front of a room full of people as he mocked the work I had dedicated half my life to. Real soldiers carry rifles, sweetheart. I pushed the echo aside as the secretary continued. Your reaction speed was remarkable. You neutralized a threat in microseconds, and the fact that you identified an infiltration method we had not seen executed at this scale suggests your instincts remain sharp. He paused, studying me with a level of intensity that made it clear he was weighing more than the crisis behind us. How did you see it? What made you look for the trail? I answered honestly. Pattern inconsistency, sir. The intrusion behaved too intelligently to be random, but too careful to leave a full footprint. When something tries that hard to hide, it always leaves a residue, even if it believes it will go unnoticed. He gave a thin, approving smile. And you noticed. That is why we need people like you in this building, Mara. People who do not miss what others dismiss. The praise landed with a hollow thud inside me because instead of pride, I felt the old familiar tension in my chest from years of being told the opposite at home. Years of hearing you think you are special, but you are not, or you are imagining problems again, or you are overreacting, Mara. It was strange how a single crisis could be solved in seconds, but the residue of a childhood spent under a dismissive voice could linger far longer than any ghost packet trail. The secretary leaned back. You will be submitting a formal report, but I wanted your verbal assessment first. Is this the start of a coordinated campaign? Yes, sir, I said. Someone is studying our corrections. They will attempt again. They always escalate after a failed probe. He nodded slowly, absorbing the implication. Then he asked something unexpected. How are you holding up, Lieutenant Colonel? I blinked at the question. Sir, you have had a long day, one with personal significance. I understand the timing was not ideal. The understatement nearly made me laugh. Not ideal. Minutes earlier, I had been at a ceremony meant to honor years of work only to be torn down in public by a man who claimed to be family. The secretary was watching me closely, so I gave a measured answer. I am prepared to continue as needed, sir. Personal circumstances will not interfere. His gaze sharpened. They did not interfere tonight. If anything, they sharpened you. You carried more pressure in 1 hour than some officers handle in an entire career. He paused. And you did it with clarity. My clarity earlier came from necessity, not confidence, but he did not need that distinction. He stood signaling the meeting was nearly over. Your command presence in the crisis room was noted. You may not realize it, but the generals deferred to your expertise without hesitation. That is rare, very rare. I felt the weight of the statement settle like armor across my shoulders. Outside these walls, my competence had been mocked, dismissed, even twisted into something laughable. But inside this room, it held gravity. Real gravity. The secretary walked around to the table, stopping beside me. You will continue leading anomaly interpretation for the duration of this investigation. Further attempts are expected, and when they come, I expect you to be ready. I looked up at him, meeting his steady gaze. I will be, sir. He gave one decisive nod. Then go get some air. You have earned it. As I exited the room, the hallway felt colder and quieter, stretching out before me like a bridge between two worlds, the one where my abilities were underestimated, ridiculed, and crushed under Ron's voice, and the one where those same abilities were the reason the lights along the eastern seaboard were still glowing tonight. And as I walked alone through the corridor, I wondered how many people live entire lives caught between who they were told they were and who they truly are when it finally matters. By the time I stepped outside the Pentagon, the night air felt colder than expected, and the sky over Arlington carried that muted orange haze that always appears when the city has been buzzing with activity for too many hours straight. I thought I would finally get a moment of silence to breathe, but within minutes, my secure and non-secure phones began vibrating almost in sync. The first message was from a colleague in public affairs, letting me know that although the operation remained classified, certain details of the crisis had already begun to circulate in the media world. Nothing explicit, just vague mentions that a lieutenant colonel in cyber defense had played a critical role in stabilizing the eastern grid after an unexpected anomaly. Another notification flashed from a national outlet asking for comment. Then another, and another. They did not have my name, but they had enough pieces to shape a story, and if there is one thing I learned in 17 years of service, it is that the world never stays quiet when the power flickers across half the coast. I ignored every message and headed toward the parking lot, but curiosity pushed me to open one of the unofficial news alerts. The headline read, Senior officer sources claim a lieutenant colonel saved the grid from cascading failure. My stomach tensed, not because of fear, but because I immediately imagined what Ron would do with this information. I could almost see him sitting on the couch in his Alexandria home, pretending to care about current events, while really just waiting for something he could twist into a brag. Except this time, the brag would expose him instead of elevating him. I slid into my car and exhaled a breath that felt heavier than anything I had released all night. My badge still hung around my neck cold against my skin. My shoulders felt stiff from adrenaline and responsibility, but the weight pressing deepest came from the knowledge that the person who had mocked me in front of a room full of officers now had no idea he was about to become the punchline to his own arrogance. I turned on the radio as I drove, and within minutes heard commentators speculating on the cause of the anomaly, emphasizing that someone inside cyber operations had acted fast enough to prevent a major disruption. One host even said, "Whoever that officer is, they deserve a medal." I gripped the wheel tighter, remembering the look on Ron's face earlier when the operator stepped off the chopper calling my rank without hesitation. I knew that expression well. It was the same look he had whenever reality contradicted the version of the world he needed to feel powerful. When I reached home, I found 15 missed calls from Mom and 3 from Ron. That alone told me everything. I listened to Mom's first voicemail. Her voice was trembling with excitement and confusion. "Mara, sweetheart, something is on the news about the grid, and they keep mentioning a cyber officer. Is it you? Are you safe? Please call me." Then I listened to Ron's first message and instantly recognized the brittle desperation in his tone. "Hey, Mara, call me back when you get this. There is something on TV and I need to ask you a few things." His second message came 10 minutes later. "Why didn't you mention you were involved in something big today? People are acting like this was serious." And the third message landed shortly after. "Look, if this is something you can talk about, you need to let us know before people start making assumptions. You do not want misinformation out there." His sudden concern had nothing to do with my safety. It was self-preservation. Ron lived his entire adult life curating an image of authority, especially military authority, and the idea that he had mocked a daughter who now appeared to be part of a major national defense event must have been tearing a hole through that carefully built facade. His fear was not subtle. It was loud in every clipped syllable and every strained breath. He was terrified of becoming a story himself, the fool who had publicly belittled the one person in the room with the clearance and technical ability to prevent an infrastructure collapse. I set my phone down and let the silence settle. It struck me that the crisis had not ended for Ron. It had only begun. The media attention grew over the next few hours, even without a name. Reporters speculated about what cyber tools had been deployed. Analysts tried to guess which branch handled the response, and online forums were buzzing with questions about who exactly had stepped in at the right moment. Some commenters even joked that the mystery officer deserved their own movie. Reading the reactions felt surreal because while strangers across the country were praising an unnamed figure, Ron was pacing his living room, sweating over the possibility that neighbors, co-workers, members of his Veterans Club, and worst of all the relatives who attended the ceremony might discover the truth that he had mocked someone who had actually been serving at a level he could not comprehend. My mother sent another text asking me to call her as soon as possible, but I was not ready to talk. I needed space to process the strange mix of exhaustion, pride, and old wounds that had cracked open again. I poured a glass of water and sat on the edge of my bed, letting the events of the day replay in a slow, looping reel. The rotor wash, the operators, the briefing, the near catastrophe, the secretary's words and Ron's voice layering mockery over all of it like static interference. And then the contrast of knowing that the same man was probably refreshing his television screen, praying no one connected the dots. CTA slip in here gently. What would you have done if someone underestimated you your whole life, only to find out you were the one protecting them in ways they never imagined? The irony of Ron's panic should have felt satisfying, but instead, it simply felt revealing. For the first time in my life, I truly saw the limits of his power. He was not a gatekeeper anymore. He was not the voice that defined my worth. He was just a man scrambling to hide the parts of himself he had once used to keep me small. And I realized something unexpected. The storm that terrified him did not frighten me at all. I woke the next morning to a soft knock at my door, the kind that tries to sound polite but carries urgency underneath. I had barely slept, and the sunlight slipping through the blinds felt sharper than usual. When I checked the peephole, my stomach tightened. Ron stood on my porch, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his expression caught somewhere between forced humility and fear. I opened the door just enough to block his view inside. He straightened immediately, as if standing at attention could erase the history carved between us. "Mara," he said, clearing his throat. "I think we need to talk." His tone tried to mimic concern, but it faltered under the strain of desperation. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, not offering him a seat or a smile. "What do you want, Ron?" He exhaled shakily, rubbing his hands together in a gesture I had seen only once before, when he lost a promotion early in my childhood and needed someone else to blame. "Look, I heard things last night, things on the news, people online saying a lieutenant colonel stopped something big, and you were whisked off in that helicopter." He paused, his eyes darting across my face as if searching for an opening. "So I guess I want to understand what happened and why the Department of Defense needed you of all people." His wording told me everything. This was not remorse. This was fear of embarrassment, fear of being revealed as the man who mocked the very person whose work had defended millions. His voice softened in a rehearsed way. "I think I deserve to know the truth, as family." I almost laughed at the sudden use of the word family because it had never been his shield before. He had spent most of my life positioning himself as the authority in the house, treating my ambitions as foolish distractions. Now he wanted answers not because he cared about my safety, but because he needed a narrative that protected him. I crossed my arms and leaned against the railing. "Why, Ron?" "So you can brag to your friends." His face twitched at the directness. "Brag? Of course not. I just want to be able to tell people correctly. You know how rumors get out of hand. So this is about controlling a story, not understanding one." He hesitated and lowered his gaze. "Some of the neighbors are asking questions. They saw the helicopter fly over the neighborhood yesterday, and someone said they recognized you getting in." He lifted his head again, forcing a rueful smile. "I just do not want people thinking I am clueless." There it was, the truth slipping out uncloaked and unpolished. I felt something inside me settle, a quiet confirmation that the man standing in front of me had not grown learned or changed. He was only reacting to the pressure closing in on him. The irony was almost cinematic. For years he tried to make me small, and now the only thing he wanted was proximity to the version of me he once insisted did not exist. I kept my voice steady. "Whatever the Department of Defense needed yesterday is not something you or anyone else outside the chain of command has the right to know." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Come on, Mara. I am not asking for classified details. I am asking what you do that is important enough for a helicopter to come get you in the middle of a ceremony." "You can trust me." I raised an eyebrow. "Trust you." The man who laughed when operators saluted me. The man who made a joke about my career in front of a room full of officers. He opened his mouth, then closed it again like a fish gasping for a breath it had not earned. "That was different," he muttered. "I did not know." "That was the point, Ron. You never cared to know. You only cared to belittle what you did not understand." His jaw tightened. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be. I just want clarity." "No," I said quietly. "Clarity for you would mean rewriting the past in a way that protects your ego. But clarity for me means accepting that you have never once come to me without wanting something in return." He bristled at that. "I came to apologize. Did you? Or did you come because you are afraid someone will tell people how you mocked me seconds before a national crisis?" He did not answer. He did not have to. His silence was the confession he could not speak. I stepped back just slightly enough to give him the message. "I am not here to give you access." His expression hardened into something brittle and defensive. "So this is how you treat family now?" I held his gaze. "Access to me must be earned. You have spent years doing the opposite." For a brief moment, something like regret flickered behind his eyes, but it faded quickly, replaced by irritation. He gestured toward my driveway as if appealing to an audience that was not there. "Fine. If you do not want to talk, just say so. But do not blame me when people start making assumptions." I almost smiled. "Let them. The truth will not hurt me." That single sentence landed like a blow. His shoulders sagged, and he looked suddenly smaller than the giant who once towered over every room. Without another word, he turned and walked down the steps. I watched him go, noting the hurried shuffle in his stride. He was not leaving because the conversation was over. He was leaving because for the first time in his life, he had no script left to perform with. As he reached his car, he paused, gripping the door handle. "Mara," he called back without turning around. "You made me look like a fool yesterday." I answered calmly. "No, Ron. You did that all by yourself." He swallowed hard, then got into the car and drove away, leaving me on the porch with a strange, unexpected calm settling over me. For the first time, I realized that I did not need an apology from him. I needed distance, and distance was finally something I had the authority to claim. 2 days passed before the confrontation finally came to a full boil, though in truth it had been simmering for decades. I had just stepped outside to water the small row of plants along my porch when I saw Ron marching up the sidewalk with a determined, almost frantic pace, his face flushed red as if the weight of the past 72 hours had finally crushed the composure he tried to maintain. I set the watering can down and waited because something in his walk told me this was not a conversation but a last stand. He stopped at the foot of my steps, breathing hard through his nose. "We need to talk right now," he snapped. I sighed quietly, already knowing that nothing he was about to say would come from humility. "So, talk." His hands balled into fists at his sides. "Do you understand what you have done to me this week? Do you have any idea how ridiculous I look?" I tilted my head slightly. "Because of your own actions or because the truth finally caught up with you?" He jerked his chin upward as if physically rejecting my words. "People are asking questions, neighbors, family, even the guys at the Veterans Club. They all want to know why I did not know my own daughter was some kind of big deal in the military." His emphasis on big deal carried bitterness, not pride. I remained still, letting the silence stretch. Finally, he spat out, "You should have told me. You should have warned me before everything exploded." I leveled my gaze at him. "I did not owe you a briefing, Ron." He scoffed loudly. "Oh, so now you are too important to talk to your own family." The hypocrisy was staggering. A lifetime of him dismissing my achievements, undermining my confidence, mocking every step of my progress. And now, here he stood, demanding access as if my career existed to keep his ego comfortable. I stepped down one stair so we were eye to eye. "Access to me must be earned. You never earned anything." For the first time in years, Ron did not have a prepared comeback. His face twisted into something between outrage and embarrassment. "You think you are better than everyone now because you ride around in secret helicopters." "That is not what I said." "You implied it," he snapped. "You think because you have some fancy clearance and people salute you that you can rewrite history." I shook my head. "No, Ron. You rewrote it every time you told me I was worthless. Every time you reduced my work to a joke. Every time you spoke louder just to silence me." He jabbed a finger toward my chest. "You are being dramatic. I only said those things to toughen you up." Classic deflection. Classic rewrite. I felt an unexpected calm wash over me. For years, his words would have pierced straight through me, but now they landed like pebbles against reinforced steel. "You called me a disappointment at 14, at 18, at 21, at 30. You mocked me at my promotion ceremony in front of officers who respected me more in a minute than you did in decades." He blinked rapidly as if trying to chase away memories that no longer served him. "You are twisting things, Mara. That is not how it happened. I simply told you the truth." "The truth according to you," I replied. "The truth that kept you safe while keeping me small. And now that people know who I am and what I do, you cannot handle the narrative shifting away from you." He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand, stopping him cold. "I am done letting you rewrite my story. I am done letting you reshape my achievements into inconveniences. I am done letting your insecurity disguise itself as authority." My voice did not rise. It did not need to. He stood frozen, absorbing the blow more deeply than he expected. For a brief second, his eyes softened, and I wondered if genuine recognition had finally broken through. But then the familiar stubbornness hardened his features again. "You are making a mistake by shutting me out, Mara. People already think you are ungrateful. They think you are using this situation to elevate yourself, and I am the one defending you." I almost laughed at the audacity. "You are defending me." He puffed up, mistaking my disbelief for opportunity. I am telling people you are not arrogant, that you just got caught up in all this attention, that you are still grounded, that you still value family. I stared at him, stunned. So, your version of defending me is telling people I could not handle success. He faltered. Well, I mean, they needed a reason. But instead of anger, I felt clarity. Brutal, freeing clarity. Ron was not here to fix anything. He was here to contain the embarrassment of losing control over a narrative he had shaped for years. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Look, Mara, I am willing to move forward if you are. I will tell people we are good. All you have to do is give me a little insight so I do not look blind. Tell me what the Pentagon needed you for. Something simple, something I can repeat. That was the moment the last remaining thread snapped. You are not asking for reconciliation. You are asking for ammunition to protect your reputation. He clenched his jaw, anger igniting behind his eyes. That is not true. I opened the door to my house without turning my back to him. It is exactly true. And this conversation is over. His voice cracked into a shout as he moved toward me. You owe me respect. I raised my hand, stopping him at the threshold. Respect is not owed. It is earned, and you never earned anything from me. I closed the door slowly, steady, firmly until the latch clicked, sealing the distance, not just physically, but permanently. Through the window, I saw him standing there stunned, betrayed by the very entitlement that had defined him. Over the next few days, the consequences unfolded naturally without my influence. Word spread quickly among relatives and neighbors that Ron had mocked me moments before a classified emergency. Some were shocked, others disappointed, but most simply shook their heads at the predictable irony. His friends at the Veterans Club grew quiet around him, no longer amused by his stories. A few even told him directly that he should be ashamed. The pedestal he had placed himself on for years crumbled under the weight of truth. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to rescue him from it. A week after the confrontation with Ron, I finally stood in the doorway of the little house on Arlington Ridge, the one I had been eyeing for months but never allowed myself to imagine owning. It sat on a quiet street with a view of the distant skyline trees framing the horizon in a way that made the world feel wider and calmer than anything I had experienced growing up. The realtor handed me the keys and congratulated me, but her voice felt distant, drowned out by the steady hum of relief building inside me. I stepped into the foyer where sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor like a welcome I had waited decades to receive. There was no shouting here, no tension thickening the air, no invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. Just space, light, quiet. I set my duffel bag down and walked through the empty rooms, letting my footsteps echo softly. The kitchen smelled faintly of the fresh paint someone had applied just days before, and the large window above the sink looked out onto a backyard where a dogwood tree stretched its branches as if offering shade to a future I had not yet dared to picture. When I placed my hand on the countertop, I felt the surprising sting of tears behind my eyes. Not from sadness, but from something gentler like recognition. For the first time in my life, I was building something completely my own. No one else's rules, no one else's expectations, no one telling me who I should be or how small I ought to stay. I spent the rest of the morning unpacking a few essentials, still moving slowly because I wanted every step to register. After years of being activated at unpredictable hours, living in dorms, barracks, transitional apartments, and temporary duty housing, the permanence of locking my own front door felt almost ceremonial. Around noon, I brewed a cup of coffee and sat on the back porch where the September air carried the crisp edge of early fall. Birds hopped along the fence line, and somewhere a lawnmower hummed faintly, a reminder that the world outside my career still existed and awaited me. I sipped my coffee and listened to the quiet. It amazed me how loud peace could be when you were not used to hearing it. My phone buzzed. It was my mom. For a moment, old reflexes tightened in my chest, but her message was short and gentle. "Can I come see you today?" I hesitated, then typed yes. She arrived an hour later, stepping carefully out of her car as though afraid to disturb whatever calm she sensed from the street. I opened the door before she knocked. Her eyes widened as she looked inside, taking in the warm light, the open floor plan, the evident independence. "Mara," she whispered, "this is beautiful." I smiled softly. "Thank you, Mom." She walked through the house, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of counters, the smooth surface of the banister. Pride flickered across her face, but something else lingered there too. A kind of dawning awareness, a recognition of how far I had come, and how far she had remained behind, trapped in patterns that had shaped both of us. When she returned to the living room, she clasped her hands nervously. "I wanted to say, 'I am sorry,'" she murmured. I waited. She swallowed. "Sorry I did not stand up for you sooner. Sorry I let Ron talk the way he did. Sorry I believed him when he made me think you were the problem." I had imagined this moment before, but always with anger, sharpness, fire. Instead, I felt only quiet acceptance. "I know, Mom." She looked relieved and heartbroken at the same time. When the news talked about the grid and that officer, I felt something in my chest. I think it was the first time I realized the world sees you the way I should have seen you all along. I touched her arm gently. "It is not too late to see me clearly now." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I just want to understand you. Not your job, not the classified things. You." That admission struck deeper than any apology could. She had spent so many years shrinking herself to keep peace in a house built on control, that understanding her own daughter often came second to appeasing a man who demanded obedience. Now, she stood in front of me without Ron's shadow stretching across her choices. She breathed in slowly. "It feels different here. Lighter." I smiled. "That is the point." We sat on the porch together for a while, watching leaves drift down from the dogwood tree. She asked small questions about the home, the neighborhood, whether I liked my new office view more than the old one. Nothing invasive. Nothing edged with Ron's influence. Just a woman trying to reconnect with a daughter she had not realized she lost in pieces over time. Eventually, she stood to leave and hugged me tightly. "I am proud of you, Mara." The words landed softly but firmly, anchoring somewhere I had kept empty for too long. After she drove away, I stayed on the porch, letting the afternoon sun warm my face. I felt the steady, quiet pulse of my own breathing and allowed myself to absorb the truth that had always been waiting beneath the noise. Healing was not a single moment. It was the accumulation of choices. Leaving the ceremony without arguing with Ron, boarding the helicopter without hesitation, closing the door in his face when he demanded access, buying this home, opening the door for my mother, choosing myself again and again, even when old patterns clawed at me to shrink. Inside the house, my phone lit up with a news alert. More media speculation swirling about the anonymous officer who saved the grid. I ignored it and turned the phone face down. The world could talk all it wanted. For once, I did not need to listen. I walked inside, letting the screen door close behind me with a gentle click. Peace does not announce itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly and stays only when you make room for it. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had. Placed gently here. Have you ever been underestimated by the very people who should have lifted you up?